Hi, I'm Dan Kibisky, co-chair of the Society of Professional Journalists International Community. Alsu Kurmasheva is a Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reporter who was improperly detained by Russian authorities more than a year ago after she visited Russia to help care for her elderly mother. Eventually, the Russian courts charged her with failure to register as a foreign agent and collecting military information about Russia to transmit to foreign sources. Now, these are the same charges Russia used to improperly jail Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Eventually, after a lot of pressure from Western news organizations and governments, Alsu and Evan were released along with 24 other improperly detained individuals in August of this year. The Voice of America put together a documentary about what Alsa's family went through during her incarceration. With me is Jessica Jerreat, lead editor of that video and chief editor for the Voice of America Press Freedom Bureau. Jessica, it's a pleasure to see you again.
It's lovely to be back, Dan. Thank you.
Okay, so first, because Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and VOA are both U.S. government-funded news agencies, could you just talk about briefly explain the relationship between the two organizations?
Of course. So VOA and RFERL, as we call Radio Free Europe, all come under this umbrella of the the US AGM, which is the Agency for Global Media. Now, they're Congress funded, but we're all editorially independent, and RFERL has a bit similar to VOA. They have bureaus that work in very sort of censored countries, sort of former Soviet republics normally, to provide in local language news. So we sister networks, essentially independent. We get our funding from Congress, but we are free as journalists to cover what we want.
Okay, so what prompted you to do this documentary on her family?
We had started to see Pavel Butorin, his Alsu Kurmasheva's husband. He's also a journalist and a colleague of ours at RFERL. So myself and the Press Freedom Desk, we started to see Pavel and the couple's two teenage daughters at a lot of press freedom community events in Washington, D.C., trying to keep her case in the news, trying to draw attention to the fact that, like Evan, who was getting a lot of media attention, Alsu was detained. She, like Evan, is an American journalist, but she has dual nationality. And it was a combination of just seeing that personal burden and having that connection with our sister network, seeing what Pavel and the daughters were going through, and also that wider issue that we still see 10 years on from the sort of Foley Foundation being founded after Jim Foley was taken, kidnapped, and sadly killed by ISIS in Syria, that families still carry the burden to advocate for their loved ones. If you're an American and you're taken hostage, and there are at least 42 Americans currently unjustly detained or held hostage overseas, the families suddenly have to navigate Congress, have to navigate media campaigns, and try to keep their loved ones' cases in the news at the same time while dealing with this huge personal burden of not knowing if this person that you care about is safe. And I think that really crystallized for us on the Press Freedom Desk an opportunity not only to draw attention to what was happening to Kurmasheva and other journalists in Russia who are being targeted a lot more, but also to try to explain what that undue burden is on families of Americans who are held overseas.
And when you brought the idea to the family, how did they react when you approached them?
I think what maybe almost made this slightly easier is Pavel is the director of Current Time, which is this sort of joint news program that VOA Russian Service and RFERL put out. So he maybe had a step up than an ordinary American who finds themselves in this situation. He really understands how a story works and how media can work. So he was just very open. And at that point, when we approached him back in, it would have been about May this year, it didn't look good for Alsu. It looked like she was just going to be held indefinitely. They were adding more charges. She was constantly having her case moved forward. And I think it just seemed a new way to sort of bring this case to people and to look at the family and explain what they're going through. It's just halfway through filming, we suddenly found ourselves in a breaking news situation with a rare good story for press freedom when we heard about the hostage negotiations.
Okay. Yeah, we did put the link for the video in the last international community newsletter, and we will have it up on our Facebook page so people will be able to watch this documentary. But this is not, Ilsa is home. Evan is home. 24 other people are home. But that's not the end of the story. There are still a lot of journalists, and as you mentioned, a lot of individuals who are being held. What can you tell us about any other people, maybe colleagues of yours, that are being held?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're going into another unprecedented year for journalists being detained globally. I think Russia still is leading this way. What we've seen this year, really, if we're starting with Russia, is a huge number of journalists being detained. I think there's around 24 still in prison in Russia. What's striking about that you don't see often with a country taking journalists into prison is that roughly half of those detained in Russia are foreign nationals, Ukrainians, Western journalists who are being picked up. It's almost like Russia is engaging in some kind of like hostage taking. They're taking these high profile Westerners, not just journalists, but many journalists, as a way to try to broker deals and keep attention on them as their options are being cut down during their war in Ukraine. The other thing that Russia's doing, which is kind of interesting, is this issuing of mass arrest warrants and charging people in absentia. And we've seen from like the New Yorker's Masha Gessen to journalists in exile who are being targeted in this way. And yes, they're not in Russia, so they're not an immediate risk. But if you're in some of the sort of satellite or Russia-friendly countries, there is a risk of being extradited. While we were in Prague filming part of this documentary, Liam Scott, who's one of the reporters for the piece, spoke with Russian exiles who have set up exiled newsrooms in Prague and other European cities. And they are being surveilled and threatened by what they believe to be Russian operatives, even though they're in this safe, EU country, which is concerning. But outside of that, even with RFERL, Alsu when she was detained, became their fourth journalist who was being held. Stephen Capers, who's the president of RFERL, tells us in the documentary that he had this moment of this grim reality setting in, that they are becoming targets just purely for their journalism. And we still have 3 RFERL colleagues detained at the moment, 1 in Russian-occupied Crimea and 2 in Belarus.
Okay, wow. And I assume everybody is doing what they can to try to get these journalists released.
Yeah, and I think it's harder on those cases. I mean, Belarus, I feel like, is a country that we need to all be as journalists looking at so much more. There's such a lot happening there. The media environment is just really under attack following on from Lukashenko's disputed election all those years ago, and the number of journalists being jailed and targeted, and the brave ones who are still there trying to work in whatever capacity they can is outstanding. But it's a country that I think, with everything that's happening globally at the moment, everyone's taken their eyes off of the fact that Lukashenko is still carrying on this mass crackdown on dissent and against his critics.
Okay. Is there anything else you would just like to add as we wind this up?
That's a good question. I think really just looking at sort of the resources available to families. And I would recommend that people check out the Foley Foundation, who have been a wonderful resource for the Press Freedom Desk, but really looking at the way that these families have to navigate Congress and media campaigns while they're trying to get their loved ones free is really, I think, an important issue to be looking at. And also, it would be remiss to not mention Austin Tice at this case. He's, I think, probably the last American journalist held overseas. He was kidnapped in Syria in 2012. And Deborah Tice's mother, I think, is about to go through her 4th US administration. And each time we have a change in administration, or each time we have an election, her case gets put back. And then she has to go in and brief people to explain, my son is a journalist and he's being held in Syria. And I think that's sort of a case that what's different in that case is we don't have any kind of diplomatic channel with Syria, as far as I'm aware of at the moment, which means that the chances of us having those amazingly heartwarming scenes that we saw with Evan and Alsu and Paul Whelan, we're not going to be seeing anytime soon for Austin. And it's just heartbreaking to think, 12 years that he's been held, an American, a former Marine. It really is time to bring him
And
back.
it's been a long time since we've seen anything of him, a video or any kind of proof of life. But it is a firm, ongoing campaign, I know, within the journalism community. We all have our armbands, and we try to make the story bring the story forward whenever we can.
And I think that's important as well. I mean, so often we're told as journalists to not make ourselves part of the story, but when we're seeing our colleagues targeted again and again, I think it is time to, it's not activism to do so. It's just telling news stories. The fact that an American is detained overseas, whether that's, Paul Whelan's case or Austin Tice or Evan and Alsu, these are important stories because this is an authoritarian regime trying to stop people accessing news and the truth. And that's really what's at the heart of it. And just using journalists as hostages in this way just is not acceptable.
Right. Well, Jessica, thank you very much for talking with us today. Really do appreciate it. And we're done.